Clumsy girl! Look at this mess! Get up this instant! Pick up that tray before I lose my temper!
The rain had not stopped for 3 days when Tamsin dropped the silver tray at the top of the servants' staircase and fell to her knees, gripping the banister with both hands. The other maids stepped over her. The housekeeper barked at her to rise, before Master Halloway saw her sprawled like that on his good carpet. But Tamsin could not rise. Her legs had swollen beneath her skirts for weeks, hidden under layers of wool, and now they betrayed her in front of the one household she could not afford to lose. "I can't walk properly," she sobbed, pressing her palm against the stair rail. "It hurts." Laughter came first, then whispers about the fat housemaid making a scene, then footsteps, heavy and unhurried, coming down from the floor above. The Duke of Brannock stopped 3 steps from her and looked down, not with pity, not with disgust, but with something colder and far more dangerous. Recognition. "How long," he asked quietly, "has this been happening to you?" What he did, in the next few minutes, silenced every mocking voice in that house. And by the time it was over, grown men who had laughed at her only moments earlier were wiping their own eyes. Tell me, if you were standing on that staircase watching this unfold, would you have laughed with the others, or would you have knelt down first? Drop a comment below and let me know which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from tonight. Hit subscribe if you want to see exactly what the Duke did next. The bell rang at 4 in the morning at Brannock Hall, and Tamsin was already awake before it sounded. She rose from her narrow bed in the attic room she shared with 2 other maids, her feet aching before her boots even touched the floor. The swelling had started weeks ago, somewhere between hauling coal buckets up 4 flights of stairs and scrubbing floors on her knees until her hands bled. She told herself it would pass. She told herself the same thing every morning, and every morning it grew worse. Peg, the youngest maid in the house, was already lacing her apron by the window. She glanced at Tamsin and wrinkled her nose the way she always did. "You walk slower every day," Peg said. "Mrs. Bramwell will notice soon enough." Tamsin said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence cost less than arguing. At 19, she had already spent 6 years in service, ever since her father's small farm failed and her mother grew too ill to work. Every coin she earned went home in a folded letter, carried by the carrier's cart twice a month. She could not afford to lose this position, no matter what her legs told her each morning. Downstairs, the kitchen was already a storm of noise and heat. Nell stirred a pot of porridge while shouting orders to a boy carrying firewood. Josiah, one of the footmen, polished silver at the long table, whistling a tune under his breath. Mrs. Bramwell, the housekeeper, stood at the center of it all like a general surveying a battlefield, her eyes sharp and unforgiving. "You're late," Mrs. Bramwell said, the moment Tamsin appeared in the doorway. "I'm sorry, ma'am. My legs." "Your legs are not my concern. This house does not run itself while you nurse complaints." Mrs. Bramwell thrust a tray into her hands. "Take this to the East Wing. Master Halloway wants his breakfast on time this morning, and mind you don't spill a drop. Master Halloway managed the estate in the Duke's long absence, and he ruled the household with a temper everyone feared. He had been steward at Brannock Hall for 11 years, and in that time he had built a reputation for cutting wages when it suited him, and working the staff past exhaustion, while claiming the Duke himself demanded such discipline. Nobody questioned him. Nobody dared, because the Duke was rarely home to hear otherwise. Tamsin climbed the east staircase with the tray balanced carefully in both hands. Each step sent a fresh jolt of pain up through her ankles and into her knees. She had wrapped her legs in strips of cloth the night before, hoping to ease the swelling, but nothing seemed to help anymore. She thought of her mother's letters, full of gratitude for the money she sent, and she forced herself up another step. 3 weeks earlier, she had slipped on the icy servant's stairs while carrying a full scuttle of coal. She remembered the sharp crack of pain in her ankle, the way her whole leg had buckled beneath her. She had not told anyone. Housemaids who complained of injury were often dismissed, replaced within a week by someone younger and stronger. She had simply wrapped the ankle tight, forced her boot over the swelling, and kept working, telling herself it would heal on its own. It had not healed. If anything, it had spread, climbing up past her knee, turning her calves a deep and troubling color beneath her stockings. She had grown skilled at hiding her limp during the day and hiding her tears at night. Master Halloway barely looked up from his letters when she entered his study. "You took your time," he said. "I do not pay you to crawl through my house like a wounded animal." "I'm sorry, sir." "Sorry does not pour my tea." He waved a dismissive hand. "Go, and tell Bramwell I want the west parlor cleaned before noon. We have no idea when His Grace might decide to grace us with his presence, and I will not have this house looking like a farmhouse when he does." Tamsin curtsied and left as quickly as her legs allowed, which was not quick at all. The other maids often whispered about her size behind cupped hands, as though her body were a fault she had chosen for herself, rather than something she had simply been born into and worked without complaint despite it. She had grown used to their comments, the way one grows used to rain. It still stung, but she no longer expected the sky to change. By mid-morning, the pain had become unbearable. Her vision blurred at the edges as she carried a tray of silver down the servant's staircase, and her right leg buckled without warning. She caught herself against the banister, gasping, and the tray slipped from her hands. Silver clattered down the stairs in a bright, terrible cascade of sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. Peg and Nell appeared at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at her. "Get up before someone sees," Nell hissed. "If Bramwell finds you sprawled like that, she'll have your position by supper." Tamsin tried. She truly tried. She gripped the banister with both hands and attempted to push herself upright, but her legs would not obey her, and a fresh wave of pain tore through her, sharp enough to steal the breath from her chest. "I can't walk properly," she sobbed, pressing her palm flat against the cold wood of the stair rail. "It hurts." Laughter came first, thin and cruel, from one of the younger footmen passing through the hall. Then whispers, the kind that traveled fast, through a house full of servants, with nothing better to occupy their minds. "The fat housemaid," they said, making a spectacle over nothing. Then came footsteps from the floor above, heavy and unhurried, entirely unlike any servant's tread. Every voice in the hallway fell silent at once. The Duke of Brannock had returned to his estate without warning, 3 days earlier than expected, and he descended the staircase now with the quiet authority of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. He stopped 3 steps above Tamsin and looked down at her, not with pity, and certainly not with the disgust she braced herself for. Something else moved across his face instead, something colder and far more dangerous to everyone standing in that hallway. "How long," he asked quietly, "has this been happening to you?" Tamsin could not answer. She had never once spoken directly to the Duke in all her years at Brannock Hall. She had seen him from a distance, at church, in his carriage, but never this close, and never while she knelt broken on his staircase, in front of every servant she worked beside. Mrs. Bramwell rushed forward, wringing her hands. "Your Grace, forgive the disturbance. The girl is clumsy, nothing more. I'll have her removed at once." "Remove her," the Duke said, "and you will follow shortly after." The hallway went utterly still. He knelt down beside Tamsin, ignoring the horrified gasps behind him, and gently lifted the hem of her skirt, just enough to see her ankle. What he found there silenced every remaining whisper in the hall. The skin had turned a deep, angry shade, swollen far beyond what any untreated sprain should look like, and when his fingers brushed lightly against it, Tamsin cried out, despite every effort to stay quiet. "Josiah," the Duke said, not looking away from her, "fetch Dr. Price from the village immediately. Tell him to bring everything he owns for a broken bone left untreated." Josiah did not wait to be told twice. "Master Halloway," the Duke continued, rising to his feet, "will explain to me exactly how a member of my household has been left to work for 3 weeks on a shattered ankle without a single soul thinking to send for a physician." Master Halloway appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by the commotion, his face draining of color the moment he understood what he had walked into. "Your Grace, I had no knowledge of any injury. If I had known—" "You did not think to ask," the Duke said. "That failure belongs to you as much as any lie would." He turned back to Tamsin, who had gone pale and quiet in her pain, and for the first time that morning, his voice softened into something the servants standing in that hallway had never once heard him use. "You will not spend another night in that attic room," he said. "Someone will carry you to the blue guest chamber this instant, and you will remain there until Dr. Price says otherwise." A ripple of shock passed through every servant present. No housemaid in the history of Brannock Hall had ever been carried to a guest chamber reserved for gentry. Peg's mouth fell open. Nell stared at Mrs. Bramwell as though waiting for someone to correct the Duke, but nobody moved to correct him. Nobody would have dared. Dr. Price arrived within the hour, his bag rattling with instruments as Josiah led him up the main staircase, 2 steps at a time. He found Tamsin propped against a mountain of pillows in a chamber far grander than anything she had ever set foot in, her ankle already beginning to bruise a deep and frightening color beneath its swelling. "How long has this leg been like this, child?" he asked, unwrapping the cloth she had bound around it weeks earlier. 3 weeks, sir. Maybe longer." Dr. Price's jaw tightened as he examined the injury with careful, practiced hands. This bone was cracked, not merely bruised. Walking on it this long has done real damage. Another fortnight, and you might have lost the use of this leg entirely. Tamsin felt her stomach drop. "Will I be able to work again?" "That depends entirely on whether you rest it properly now, or whether someone forces you back to your duties before it heals." The Duke stood near the doorway throughout the examination, arms folded, his expression unreadable to everyone but Dr. Price, who had known him since childhood and could read the fury simmering beneath his calm exterior. "She will rest for as long as you say necessary," the Duke said. "Every day, without exception." Dr. Price raised an eyebrow, but said nothing further on the matter, choosing instead to focus on setting the ankle properly and wrapping it in fresh linen. Tamsin bit down hard on her lip through the process, refusing to cry out again in front of him, though tears slipped free regardless. News of what had happened spread through the household faster than any fire could have. By the time supper was served below stairs, every servant at Brannock Hall knew that the Duke himself had carried the fat housemaid's welfare above the running of his own estate, and opinions on the matter split sharply down the middle. "He's gone soft," one of the older footmen muttered over his bowl of stew. "A duke does not concern himself with a housemaid's ankle." "He concerned himself plenty," Josiah countered. "You didn't see his face when he found her on those stairs. I've served this house for 4 years, and never once seen him like that." Mrs. Bramwell said little, though her hands trembled as she poured tea that evening, and more than one maid noticed how carefully she avoided looking toward the staircase where it had all happened. Guilt sat heavy on her, though she would never have admitted it aloud, not with Master Halloway watching her every movement as though searching for someone to blame besides himself. Master Halloway, for his part, spent the evening locked in his study, and those who passed by claimed they heard him pacing long after the candles below stairs had been snuffed out. He had built his position on the assumption that the Duke's absence gave him free rein over every decision in that house, and now, without warning, that assumption had crumbled beneath him. Upstairs, Tamsin drifted in and out of an uneasy sleep, her ankle throbbing beneath its careful wrapping. Sometime past midnight, she woke to find the Duke seated near the window of her chamber, a single candle burning low beside him, a small object turning slowly between his fingers. "Your Grace," she said, startled, attempting to sit up, despite the pain it cost her. "You needn't trouble yourself watching over me." "I could not sleep," he said simply, though something in his tone suggested there was more to it than a restless mind. She noticed then what he held between his fingers, a small silver locket, tarnished with age, the kind of trinket a servant girl might carry, hidden beneath her collar, rather than display openly. It had slipped free from beneath her nightclothes sometime during the examination, and Dr. Price had set it aside on the bedside table without a second thought. The Duke turned it over slowly, studying the faint engraving, worn nearly smooth by years of handling. When he looked up at her again, his expression had changed entirely, no longer simply concerned but searching, as though he were trying to place a memory just out of reach. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice quieter than she had yet heard it. "It belonged to my mother, sir. She gave it to me before I left home to enter service. I don't know much more about it than that." "Do you know your mother's maiden name?" Tamsin blinked at the strange question, confused by the sudden intensity in his eyes. "Fairly, sir. Why do you ask?" The candle beside him flickered, and for a long moment, the Duke of Brannock said nothing at all, staring down at the small locket in his palm, as though it had just told him something he had spent years trying not to remember. "That name," he said finally, "is one I have not heard spoken aloud in a very long time." Tamsin lay awake long after the Duke left her chamber that night, the small silver locket resting once again against her collarbone, where it had always belonged. She turned his question over and over in her mind. Fairly. He had said the name as though it carried weight far beyond a simple word, as though it belonged to something buried deep in his own past, rather than hers. She did not know much about her mother's family. Her mother rarely spoke of her girlhood, and when she did, her voice always grew thin and careful, the way a person speaks when they are choosing each word to avoid another. Tamsin knew only that her mother had come from somewhere north of the county before marrying her father and settling on the small farm that eventually failed. Beyond that, the past remained a locked door nobody in her family seemed willing to open. Morning brought Dr. Price back to check her ankle, and with him came a change in the household that nobody below stairs could ignore. The Duke had given strict instruction that Tamsin's meals be brought to her chamber on proper trays, the same trays used for guests of standing, and that a young maid named Effie be assigned to assist her until she could walk unaided again. Effie was barely 15, new to service, and utterly without the guile that seemed to infect the older staff. She arrived each morning with genuine warmth, fussing over Tamsin's pillows and chattering about the goings-on below stairs, without a hint of the cruelty Tamsin had grown used to enduring from Peg and the others. "Mrs. Bramwell has been strange all week," Effie said one morning, arranging a fresh pitcher of water on the bedside table. "She barely speaks unless spoken to, and she jumps whenever Master Halloway enters a room." "She's frightened of him," Tamsin said, thinking of the years she had watched Mrs. Bramwell bend to every demand the steward made without question. "Frightened of what, though? She's the housekeeper. She answers to nobody but the Duke himself." Tamsin had no answer for that, though something about the arrangement had always struck her as strange, even before her injury. Master Halloway held influence over every corner of Brannock Hall that seemed to exceed his station, and Mrs. Bramwell, for all her sharp tongue and stern manner, never once challenged him, not even when his demands grew unreasonable. Downstairs, in the privacy of his study, Master Halloway sat before a ledger with numbers that did not add correctly, no matter how many times he recalculated them. For years, he had skimmed small amounts from the household accounts, adjusting figures here and there, confident that the Duke's long absences abroad meant nobody would ever look closely enough to notice. Now the Duke had returned unannounced, and worse, he had turned his full attention toward a housemaid Halloway had never once considered worth remembering. A knock came at his door, and Mrs. Bramwell entered, wringing her hands the way she had taken to doing all week. "He asked me this morning about the household accounts," she said. "He wants to review every ledger from the past 3 years before he departs again for London." Halloway's pen stilled against the page. Did he say why? He did not need to say why. You know as well as I do what he suspects. He suspects nothing, Halloway snapped, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. He is distracted by that girl and her ridiculous trinket. Once his curiosity fades, he will return to London and forget this house exists, same as always. Mrs. Bramwell hesitated at the door. "And if he does not forget? If he finds what you've been hiding in those ledgers?" Halloway rose from his chair, his expression darkening in a way that made even Mrs. Bramwell take a step backward. "Then perhaps it is time we ensured his attention lands elsewhere. That housemaid has proven remarkably useful for stirring his sympathy. She could prove equally useful for stirring his suspicion, if guided in the right direction." Mrs. Bramwell did not ask what he meant. She had worked alongside Halloway long enough to understand that some questions were safer left unasked. That afternoon, the Duke sat in his study, surrounded by correspondence he had neglected during his months abroad, though his attention kept drifting toward the small locket he had returned to Tamsin the night before. He remembered a name from his childhood, spoken rarely and only in hushed tones by his late mother, a name connected to a scandal that had rocked their family decades earlier and had never been fully explained to him. His mother had once mentioned a sister, estranged long before his birth, who had married beneath her station and vanished from polite society entirely. The family had spoken of her only as a cautionary tale, a warning against foolish choices made in the name of affection rather than sense. Her name, buried deep in his memory until the previous night, had been Fairley. He summoned his private secretary, a careful and discreet man named Osric, who had served the family for over a decade, and asked him to locate any correspondence or records related to his mother's estranged sister. "It may take several days, Your Grace," Osric said. "Records from that far back are not always well kept, particularly if the family wishes the matter forgotten." "Take whatever time you require," the Duke said. "But find her, Osric. I need to know if there is any connection between that woman and the girl currently recovering in my guest chamber." Osric bowed and departed to begin his search, leaving the Duke alone with his thoughts, and the quiet, persistent feeling that something long buried in his family's past had just resurfaced without warning. 3 days passed before Tamsin was permitted to walk even short distances, leaning heavily on a cane Dr. Price provided for her use. She insisted on returning to her duties despite everyone's protests, unable to bear the guilt of lying idle while the other maids worked twice as hard to cover her absence. Mrs. Bramwell met her in the hallway on her first day back, and to Tamsin's surprise, the housekeeper's manner had softened considerably. "You'll take light duties only," Mrs. Bramwell said, though her voice lacked its usual sharpness. "Folding linens, perhaps, or assisting in the kitchen. Nothing that requires the stairs. Thank you, ma'am. Mrs. Bramwell lingered a moment longer than necessary, studying Tamsin's face with an expression Tamsin could not quite place. You favor your mother, you know. Around the eyes. Tamsin froze. You knew my mother, ma'am? Mrs. Bramwell's expression shuttered instantly, as though she regretted the words the moment they left her mouth. I misspoke. Get to your duties, girl. She turned and walked briskly away before Tamsin could ask anything further, leaving Tamsin standing alone in the hallway with more questions than she had carried before. That evening, while assisting in the kitchen, Tamsin overheard Josiah and Nell speaking in low voices near the pantry. Unaware, she stood close enough to hear every word. Holloway's been asking questions about her, Josiah said. Wanted to know if she's ever taken anything from the household stores without permission. Asked me directly if I'd seen her near the silver cabinet. Why would he ask that? Nell whispered. I don't know, but I didn't like the way he asked it. Like he already had an answer in mind, and was only looking for someone to agree with him. Tamsin's stomach turned cold. She had never once taken anything that did not belong to her, not even during the leanest months when her family's farm had failed and hunger had gnawed at her for weeks at a time. The suggestion that Holloway might accuse her of theft, and worse, that he had already begun laying groundwork for such an accusation, frightened her more than she cared to admit. She said nothing to anyone that night, choosing instead to carry the fear quietly, the way she had carried every other burden in her life. But sleep came slowly, and when it finally did, it brought uneasy dreams of locked doors and half-remembered names. The accusation came 4 days later, delivered with the precision of a man who had planned every detail in advance. Tamsin had just finished folding linens in the laundry room when Master Holloway appeared in the doorway, flanked by 2 footmen she did not recognize, hired hands brought in temporarily from the village to assist with the harvest preparations. Search her belongings, Holloway said flatly, not bothering to address Tamsin directly. Search for what, sir? Tamsin asked, her voice shaking, despite her effort to steady it. A silver candlestick has gone missing from the west parlor. Given your recent proximity to areas of the house you have no business entering, I believe an inspection is warranted. I've taken nothing, sir. I swear it. Your word means little against evidence, girl. The 2 footmen searched her small trunk in the attic room with rough, careless hands, tossing her few belongings across the floor, while Peg and Nell watched from the doorway, whispering behind cupped palms. Tamsin stood frozen, humiliation burning hot across her face, as strangers poured through the meager possessions that represented everything she owned in the world. One of the footmen straightened suddenly, holding up a small silver object wrapped in a cloth at the bottom of her trunk. Found something, sir. Tamsin's blood ran cold. She had never seen the object before in her life. That's not mine, she said, her voice rising in panic. I've never seen that before. Holloway examined the candlestick with theatrical solemnity. A remarkable coincidence, wouldn't you agree, that a missing item should appear in the very trunk of a housemaid recently caught, stealing the Duke's attention through pity and false injury. My injury was not false, Tamsin said, tears spilling freely now. You know it was not. I know only what evidence tells me. Holloway turned to the gathered servants. Escort her to the study. His Grace will decide her fate himself. Word of the accusation spread through the house, faster than Tamsin could be marched down the stairs, and by the time she reached the study door, half the household staff had gathered in the corridor to witness the outcome, some out of genuine concern, and others simply hungry for spectacle. The Duke sat behind his desk when Holloway pushed Tamsin into the room, the recovered candlestick presented before him like a trophy. Your Grace, Holloway said, his voice smooth with practiced confidence. I regret to inform you that this girl has been discovered in possession of stolen household silver. Given the pattern of her recent behavior, I recommend immediate dismissal, without reference, effective this hour. The Duke did not touch the candlestick. Instead, he studied Tamsin's face for a long moment, taking in her trembling hands and the raw fear written plainly across her features. "Did you take this candlestick?" he asked her directly. "No, Your Grace. I swear on my mother's life, I have never seen that object before this moment." She would say anything to save her position. Holloway interjected. "The evidence speaks plainly enough. I did not ask for your assessment of her honesty, Holloway. I asked her a direct question, and I intend to give her the courtesy of an answer without interruption." The Duke's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "Tell me, who searched her belongings?" "Two men from the village, brought in temporarily for the harvest, Your Grace. Reliable men, both of them. Men you selected personally, I assume, rather than trusted members of my own household staff." Holloway's confidence faltered for the first time. "I saw no reason to involve regular staff in a matter requiring discretion." "How convenient," the Duke said, "that the men who discovered this evidence answer to nobody but you, and that neither Mrs. Bramwell nor Josiah, nor any member of staff I actually trust was present to witness the search." Josiah stepped forward from the gathered crowd in the corridor, his expression grim. "Your Grace, if I may speak, I was in the corridor near the laundry room that entire morning. Master Holloway arrived with those two men not 10 minutes before the search began, and I never once saw Tamsin near the west parlor, where the candlestick supposedly went missing." "That proves nothing," Holloway said quickly. "She could have taken it days ago and hidden it since." "Then explain," the Duke said, rising slowly from his chair, "why the candlestick bears no dust, no tarnish, nothing consistent with sitting hidden in a trunk for days, while every other item in this household that has gone untouched for even a week carries the marks of neglect that this house is unfortunately known for." Silence fell across the room. Holloway's face had drained of color entirely. "Osric," the Duke called, and his secretary appeared in the doorway, as though he had been waiting for precisely this moment. "You mentioned to me yesterday that you found irregularities in the household ledgers dating back several years. Would you care to share what you discovered?" Osric stepped forward, a leather folder tucked beneath his arm. "Discrepancies totaling several £100, Your Grace, across 3 years of accounts, each adjustment made in Master Holloway's own hand, disguised as expenditures for repairs that no tradesman in the village has any record of performing." The gathered servants in the corridor began to murmur, and Mrs. Bramwell, standing near the back of the crowd, pressed a trembling hand against her mouth. "You accuse me of theft," the Duke said, turning his full attention back to Holloway, "while standing atop years of your own. Tell me, was framing an innocent girl truly worth the risk of drawing my attention toward accounts you hoped I would never examine closely?" Holloway's composure shattered entirely. "Your Grace, I can explain everything, if you would only allow me a private audience." "You will have your audience," the Duke said coldly, "with the magistrate." 2 footmen, these ones long-time members of the household and utterly loyal, stepped forward at the Duke's signal and escorted Holloway from the room, his protests growing fainter as he was led away down the corridor. The Duke turned back to Tamsin, who stood frozen near the doorway, overwhelmed by the sudden and complete reversal of her fortune within the span of a single conversation. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, "for allowing this house to be run by a man capable of such cruelty for so long without my knowledge. You owe me nothing, Your Grace. You saved me twice in the span of a week. Perhaps," he said, "though I suspect fate intends for me to owe you a great deal more before this matter concludes." He gestured for Osric to step forward again, and the secretary produced a second folder from beneath his arm, this one older, its edges worn soft with age. I asked Osric to search for any record of my mother's estranged sister, the Duke said, the woman who carried the name Fairly before her marriage. Tamsin's breath caught. Did he find anything, Your Grace? He found a marriage record, dated some 22 years ago, listing a woman named Beatrice Fairly as the bride. He paused, studying Tamsin's face carefully. What was your mother's Christian name? Tamsin's hands began to tremble. Beatrice, Your Grace. The room fell utterly silent. Every servant still gathered in the corridor, straining to hear what would come next, sensing that whatever truth was about to surface would change everything they thought they understood about the fat housemaid who had collapsed on the staircase only a week before. The silence in the study stretched long enough that Tamsin could hear her own heartbeat pounding against her ribs. The Duke stood with the worn folder still open in his hands, his eyes fixed on her, as though seeing her for the first time since she had entered his service 3 years earlier. Beatrice Fairly, he said again, quieter now, testing the name against some memory he had carried since childhood. My aunt vanished from my family's life before I was old enough to remember her face clearly. My mother spoke of her only twice in my presence, and both times she wept afterward and refused to explain why, no matter how many times I asked as a boy. My mother never speaks of her family either, Tamsin said, her voice unsteady. Only that she married beneath what her people wanted for her, and that the choice cost her everything she once had. She never named names. She never told me what she gave up, only that she would give it up again without hesitation. Then it seems, the Duke said, closing the folder gently, that the choice cost her more than either of us understood until this very moment, standing in this room. Osric cleared his throat, stepping forward with the careful manner of a man accustomed to delivering delicate news. Your Grace, if the connection proves accurate once confirmed through proper record, this would make the young woman your cousin by blood, and a legitimate one at that, given the marriage record I discovered was filed and witnessed according to law. The word cousin rippled through the corridor outside the study, where every servant still lingered despite having no true reason left to remain at their posts. Peg's mouth fell open, her earlier scorn curdling visibly into something closer to disbelief. Nell grabbed her arm, as though needing something solid to hold on to, while the ground shifted beneath everything she had assumed about the girl she mocked only days before. Mrs. Bramwell pressed both hands over her face and turned away entirely, her shoulders shaking, with something that looked far too much like guilt to be simple shock. The Duke noticed immediately. Bramwell, you knew. Mrs. Bramwell lowered her hands slowly, her face wet with tears. She made no effort to hide from the gathered household. I suspected, Your Grace, from the moment I first laid eyes on the girl 3 years ago, when she entered service here, as little more than a child. She carries her mother's face so plainly that I could not mistake it. Not after serving your family since before you were born, and knowing every feature of your mother's line, as well as I know my own. You knew and said nothing. The Duke's voice carried no anger, only a deep and weary disappointment that seemed to weigh heavier on Mrs. Bramwell than any shout could have. For 3 years, you watched my cousin scrub floors on her knees and haul coal up 4 flights of stairs in this house, and you never once thought to tell me, even during my visits home. What was I meant to say, Your Grace? Mrs. Bramwell's voice cracked entirely now. That a housemaid shared blood with the family, that dismissed her mother as though she never existed at all. Your own grandfather forbade her name from being spoken anywhere within these walls, and the servants who served him then passed that silence down to those of us who came after. I feared what might happen to her if the truth surfaced while you were away in London, and Holloway held such influence over every decision made in this house. I thought silence protected her. I see now how wrong I was to think so. Tamsin felt the room tilting slightly around her, too many revelations arriving too quickly for her mind to hold steady against them. She thought of her mother, sitting alone in their small cottage with its leaking roof and its bare cupboards, carrying a secret so heavy that she had never once let it slip in all the years Tamsin had known her, not even during the hardest winters when the truth might have brought them help. "I need to write to my mother," Tamsin said suddenly, straightening despite the ache still radiating up from her ankle. She deserves to know what has happened here before anyone else decides what to do with this truth on her behalf. She has spent too many years having decisions made for her by people who never once asked what she wanted. "You will write to her," the Duke agreed, "and she will come here herself, as my guest, the moment she is able to travel safely. I will send my own carriage to fetch her, properly fitted for comfort, and I will not accept any argument to the contrary, from her or from you." Before Tamsin could respond, a commotion rose from the front entrance of the house, footsteps and raised voices echoing down the main corridor with an urgency that pulled every eye toward the sound. Josiah appeared in the study doorway moments later, his expression tight, with a fresh kind of alarm, entirely separate from the morning's revelations. "Your Grace, the magistrate has arrived earlier than expected, along with 2 constables. They wish to question Master Holloway immediately, and they've brought news that concerns the entire household, not just the matter of the ledgers." The Duke's jaw tightened visibly. "What news, Josiah? Speak plainly." "It seems Holloway attempted to bribe one of the constables on the road here, offering a sum far too large to be mistaken for anything but desperation, rather than buying silence. The offer raised enough suspicion that the magistrate rode ahead immediately, believing there may be far more hidden in Holloway's affairs than the ledger discrepancies alone could account for." Tamsin watched the Duke's expression shift from weary relief into something sharper and more focused, the look of a man recognizing that one battle had only revealed the edges of a much larger one waiting beneath it. "Bring the magistrate to the front parlor," the Duke said. "I will speak with him directly and answer whatever questions he carries. Osric, gather every ledger and record connected to Holloway's tenure here, every scrap of paper bearing his hand. If there is more to uncover beneath what we have already found, I want it found before nightfall, not left to fester another day under this roof." As the household staff scattered to their assigned tasks, some hurrying toward the front parlor and others toward the study's records cabinet, the Duke turned back to Tamsin, his voice softening once more into something gentler than the command he had just issued. "You should rest," he said. "This has been an overwhelming day for you, cousin or not, and Dr. Price would scold us both if he learned you had spent it standing on that ankle longer than necessary." The word cousin sat strangely between them, foreign and new, and Tamsin found herself searching his face for some sign of regret at the discovery, some flicker of resentment at finding a servant girl tangled unexpectedly into his bloodline after a lifetime of certainty about who belonged within his family and who did not. She found none, only a steadiness that seemed to have settled deeper into him since the truth had surfaced, as though the discovery had given him something solid to stand on, rather than something to mourn. "Your Grace," she said carefully, gripping the edge of the desk for support. "Will this change how the household treats me? Peg and Nell have mocked me for years over my size, my slowness, my place beneath them in this house. Now they'll simply find new reasons, born from envy instead of cruelty, and I fear that may prove harder to endure than what came before. They will treat you," the Duke said firmly, "with the respect due to any member of this household, blood relation or not, because I will demand nothing less from this day forward, and I will make certain every servant beneath this roof understands that expectation clearly. What happened to you on that staircase should never have been permitted to happen at all, not to a housemaid, and certainly not to my own cousin, and I intend to see that no one in my service ever suffers such neglect again." Before she could respond further, Effie burst into the study, breathless and wide-eyed, her cap askew from running. "Your Grace, forgive the interruption, but Master Halloway has escaped his confinement in the east cellar. The footmen guarding him say he struck one of them across the face and fled through the servants' passage toward the stables not 5 minutes ago." The Duke moved instantly, all softness vanishing from his expression as he strode toward the door with the same unhurried authority Tamsin had first witnessed on the staircase, though now edged with real urgency beneath its calm surface. "Josiah, with me. Osric, secure those ledgers and do not let them out of your sight for even a moment, no matter what commotion follows." Tamsin rose, despite her still healing ankle, gripping the edge of the desk hard enough to whiten her knuckles. "Your Grace, please, be careful. A man cornered has nothing left to lose, and desperation makes even a coward dangerous." He paused at the doorway and looked back at her, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, an expression she could not yet name, but felt certain she would remember for a long time afterward. "I have a great deal left to protect now, Tamsin. That will not change my caution, but it will change my resolve entirely." He disappeared down the corridor with Josiah close behind him, their footsteps fading quickly toward the rear of the house, leaving Tamsin standing alone in the study, with Effie, the discarded ledgers, and a storm of fear rising in her chest that she could not fully name or steady. Somewhere beyond the walls of Brannock Hall, a desperate man fled through the stables with nothing left to hide and everything to lose, and the cousin she had never known she possessed rode straight into whatever danger awaited him, leaving her to wait, helpless and aching, for word of what would happen next. The stable yard erupted into chaos the moment the Duke rounded the corner behind Josiah, boots skidding against wet cobblestone still slick from the week's rain. Master Halloway stood near the far stall, one hand gripping the bridle of a half-saddled horse, the other clutching a satchel stuffed with papers he had apparently thought worth stealing on his way out. "Halloway," the Duke called, his voice carrying across the yard with a force that stilled even the horses. "There is nowhere on this estate you can ride. That word of your crimes will not reach before you do." Halloway turned, wild-eyed, his usual composure stripped away entirely. "You don't understand what you've unraveled, Your Grace. There are debts, obligations, arrangements made years before you ever inherited this house. I did what I did to survive, nothing more. You did what you did to enrich yourself, while a housemaid worked 3 weeks on a shattered bone because she feared losing her position under your rule." The Duke stepped closer, unarmed but utterly unafraid. "Survival does not require framing an innocent girl for theft to cover your own failings." Halloway's grip tightened on the satchel, and for one terrible moment, it seemed he might mount the horse and force his way past them regardless of the consequences. His eyes darted toward the open stable door, calculating some final desperate escape, and Josiah stepped sideways to block his path without waiting for instruction. "Don't be foolish," Josiah said quietly. "There's nowhere left to run that this won't follow you." Then the sound of additional footsteps arrived, the magistrate and his 2 constables rounding the stable entrance with pistols drawn, and expressions that left no room for negotiation. "It's finished, Halloway," the magistrate said. "Step away from the horse." Something in Halloway seemed to collapse all at once, the fight draining out of him as quickly as it had risen. He released the bridle and sank against the stall door, the satchel slipping from his fingers and spilling papers across the straw-covered ground. Records of debts, false accounts, and correspondence that would take Osric and the magistrate's clerks weeks to fully untangle. "You'll regret this," Holloway muttered, though the threat carried no weight anymore, only the bitter resentment of a man who had lost everything within the span of a single week. "This house was mine to run, long before that girl ever set foot in it." "This house was never yours," the Duke said. "You only convinced yourself of it because no one stood close enough to correct you." The constables led him away in silence, and the Duke stood watching until the sound of hooves and wheels faded entirely down the drive, carrying Holloway toward whatever judgment awaited him in the county courts. Word arrived some weeks later that he had been sentenced to a lengthy term for fraud and theft from the estate, his name struck from every respectable household's guest list from that day onward. Back inside Brannock Hall, the household staff gathered in the great hall that evening, summoned by an announcement that had traveled through every corridor within the hour. Tamsin stood beside the Duke near the grand staircase, dressed now in a simple gown Effie had helped her into. Plain but well-fitted, nothing like the worn and patched uniform she had worn every day for 3 years prior. "Many of you have served this house faithfully for years," the Duke said, addressing the full assembly of servants gathered before him. "You deserve to hear the truth directly from me, rather than through whispers passed hand to hand below stairs. Tamsin, who has worked among you as a housemaid since she was 16 years old, has this week been confirmed as my cousin, daughter of my late mother's estranged sister, Beatrice Fairley." A murmur swept through the hall, though far softer than it might have been days earlier, tempered now by everything the staff had witnessed unfold over the past week. "She will remain at Brannock Hall," the Duke continued, "not as a servant, but as a member of this family, with all the respect and consideration that position demands. I expect every person in this hall to extend her that respect, from this day forward, without exception, and I will not tolerate a repeat of the cruelty she endured under this roof before I returned." Peg lowered her eyes, unable to meet Tamsin's gaze, her earlier scorn replaced now with something closer to shame. Nell offered a small, uncertain curtsy that Tamsin accepted with a nod, rather than any lingering resentment. She had carried enough anger already that week. She had no wish to carry more of it forward into whatever came next. "I owe you an apology," Peg said afterward, catching Tamsin alone near the kitchen entrance once the hall had emptied. "I said cruel things about you, more times than I can count, and I never once stopped to wonder what pain you were hiding beneath your skirts, while I mocked you for it." "You believed what everyone around you believed," Tamsin said. "I don't hold it against you, Peg. I only hope you'll remember it the next time someone else limps up those stairs." 3 days later, a carriage arrived bearing Tamsin's mother, thin and travel-worn, but alive with an emotion Tamsin had rarely seen cross her face before. Beatrice stepped down from the carriage slowly, her eyes sweeping across the grand facade of Brannock Hall before finding her daughter waiting at the entrance. "I never thought I would see these walls again," Beatrice said quietly, her voice trembling. "I never thought I would want to." The Duke greeted her personally, offering his arm to help her up the front steps, despite the fact that she had once been forbidden from crossing this very threshold by his own grandfather. "You are welcome here, Aunt Beatrice, for as long as you wish to stay, and longer still, if you'll allow it." Beatrice paused at the top of the steps, looking back once at the drive behind her, as though checking whether the past might still follow her inside. "Your grandfather stood in this very doorway the day he told me never to return. I half expected the walls themselves to refuse me." "The walls answer to me now," the Duke said gently, and I have no intention of repeating my grandfather's mistakes." That evening, mother and daughter sat together in the drawing room, long after the rest of the household had retired, exchanging years of silence in a single conversation that stretched past midnight. Beatrice explained finally what she had never dared explain before: how she had fallen in love with a farmer against her family's wishes, how her father had disowned her entirely rather than accept the match, and how she had carried that grief quietly for over 20 years, rather than burden her daughter with a past that could not be undone. "I only ever wanted you to have a chance I never had," Beatrice said, gripping Tamsin's hands tightly. "I never imagined it would come to you this way, through suffering rather than choice." "Perhaps it needed to come this way," Tamsin said gently. "Perhaps some doors only open when we've earned the strength to walk through them properly, rather than being handed the key without ever learning its weight." Beatrice wept then, quiet tears that carried 20 years of buried sorrow, and Tamsin held her mother's hands until the candle beside them burned low, and the household fell fully silent around them. In the weeks that followed, Brannock Hall settled into a rhythm entirely different from the one it had known before. Mrs. Bramwell, still carrying the weight of her years of silence, devoted herself to Tamsin's comfort with a fierce and quiet loyalty that spoke louder than any apology could have. She oversaw the preparation of Tamsin's permanent chambers herself, insisting on details no one else would have thought to consider, and slowly, over many small gestures, earned back a measure of the trust her silence had once cost her. Josiah and Effie remained close companions, often found laughing together in the kitchen over memories of the week that had changed everything, and Dr. Price continued to visit regularly to ensure Tamsin's ankle had healed properly, declaring by the second month that she could walk without her cane entirely, though she kept it near her chamber regardless, a quiet reminder of everything that single injury had set into motion. The Duke, though he never spoke of it directly, found himself seeking Tamsin's company more often than propriety strictly required, drawn to her steady warmth in a way he had not expected when he first found her collapsed and sobbing on his staircase. He began inviting her to sit with him during his evening correspondence, valuing her opinion on matters of the estate far more than he had ever valued anyone's counsel besides Osric's, and slowly the household grew accustomed to seeing them together, the Duke and his once-forgotten cousin, walking the grounds or sharing quiet conversation near the fountain. On a quiet afternoon in early autumn, the Duke found Tamsin in the garden, seated near the old stone fountain where she had taken to reading in the hours between her new duties assisting Osric with the estate's correspondence. "You've grown stronger these past months," he said, settling onto the bench beside her. "I remember how you could barely stand that first week." "I remember it too," Tamsin said, smiling faintly. "I remember thinking my life had ended on that staircase, and instead, it had only just begun." He studied her for a long moment, something warm and unguarded crossing his features. "I confess, cousin, that I have grown rather fond of having you beneath this roof. This house feels less empty than it has in years, and I find myself dreading the day you might wish to leave it for a household of your own." "I have no wish to leave," Tamsin said. "Not when I've only just found a place where I finally belong, without condition." "Then perhaps," he said, "we might consider this house as much your home as mine, not out of obligation, but out of choice, the very thing your mother was denied all those years ago." They sat together in comfortable silence as the afternoon light stretched long across the garden. Two people bound now by blood and by every hardship that had led them to this moment, ready at last to build something neither of them had expected when the week began. Somewhere behind them, the sound of Beatrice's laughter drifted from an open window, mingling with Effie's cheerful chatter, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Tamsin allowed herself to believe that the pain she had carried up that staircase had finally led her somewhere worth arriving at. Now tell me, if you had been standing in that hallway the day Master Halloway tried to frame an innocent girl, would you have believed the evidence, or would you have trusted your instincts the way Josiah did? And what did you make of Mrs. Bramwell keeping such a heavy secret for 3 long years? Protection or cowardice? Drop your answers in the comments below, and let me know which beautiful part of the world you're watching from tonight. If this story pulled at your heart even a little, hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. And I'll be right there in the comments waiting to see whose guesses landed closest to the truth.